Today we will talk about government policy and international trade. This chapter focuses on the political realities of international trade. While many countries claim to support free trade, they often intervene to protect key domestic industries or for national security reasons. For example, U.S. presidents, including Bush, Obama, Trump, and likely Biden, have imposed tariffs on steel to protect domestic producers. Similarly, the Jones Act has protected the U.S. maritime market since 1920, despite criticism from free trade advocates. The chapter also examines the policy tools governments use to intervene in trade, the political and economic motives behind these actions, and how these interventions challenge the case for free trade. It reviews the development of the international trading system, particularly the role of GATT and the WTO, and highlights America's recent shift toward bilateral trade agreements and managed trade. Finally, it discusses the implications of these trade realities for management practices. Okay, we will discuss various trade policy instruments, including tariffs, bans, subsidies, import quotas, voluntary export restraints, local content requirements, administrative policies, and anti-dumping duties. Tariffs are highlighted as a primary instrument, with specific and ad valorem tariffs affecting the value of imported goods. Import tariffs, exemplified by the 2018 steel tariff imposed by President Trump, aim to protect domestic producers by raising import prices. However, they also burden consumers and can lead to job losses in industries reliant on imports. Economic analyses generally show that import tariffs benefit producers while harming consumers and reducing overall economic efficiency by encouraging domestic production, even when it's less efficient. Export tariffs and bans are less common, with nations like China using export tariffs historically to ensure domestic supply. Export bans, such as the U.S. crude oil export ban of 1975, are implemented to maintain domestic supply and stabilize prices. Recent examples include the 2015 lifting of the U.S. oil export ban and the 2019 export ban on microprocessors to Huawei. These policies can have mixed impacts on domestic industries and consumers, affecting economic growth and national security. Subsidies, as government payments to domestic producers, come in various forms like cash grants, low-interest loans, tax breaks, and equity participation. They aim to lower production costs, aiding domestic producers in competing against imports and accessing export markets. Agriculture is a major recipient of subsidies globally, with significant sums disbursed by entities like the EU, the U.S., and Japan. In the early 2000s, countries spent around $300 billion on subsidies, predominantly by developed nations, including substantial support to industries like automobiles during the financial crisis. While subsidies can enhance domestic producers' competitiveness, they may lead to unfair advantages in global markets. Strategic trade policy proponents advocate subsidies to help firms excel in industries with economies of scale, like commercial aircraft and semiconductors, fostering first-mover advantages and economic benefits. Debates persist on whether subsidies outweigh their costs, with concerns that they often shield inefficiencies and spur overproduction. Studies suggest that eliminating agricultural subsidies could significantly boost global trade and wealth, indicating the potential for enhanced efficiency and economic gains from subsidy reform. Import quotas are direct restrictions on the quantity of a specific good that can be imported into a country, often enforced through import licenses granted to select individuals or firms. For instance, the United States maintains a cheese import quota where designated trading companies are allocated annual import limits. A tariff rate quota combines elements of a quota and a tariff, imposing lower tariffs on imports within the quota compared to those exceeding it, commonly observed in agriculture to restrict over-quota imports. Voluntary export restraints, VERS, are another form of trade restriction, where exporting countries voluntarily limit exports at the importing country's request to avoid harsher measures like tariffs or quotas. An example is Brazil imposing VERS on vehicle shipments from Mexico in response to increased imports. Import quotas and VERS, like tariffs and subsidies, primarily benefit domestic producers by curbing import competition, but raise prices for consumers. The limited supply under quotas or VERS can inflate prices, leading to what's known as quota rent. In cases where domestic industries cannot meet demand, quotas may inflate prices for both local and imported goods, as seen in the U.S. sugar industry, where import quotas have inflated sugar prices domestically, benefiting U.S. producers but leading to consumer price hikes. A local content requirement, LCR, mandates that a specific portion of a product be produced domestically, either by components or by value. Developing countries often use LCRs to promote local manufacturing, while developed countries use them to protect local jobs and industries from foreign competition. For instance, the U.S. Buy America Act requires that 51% of the value of products purchased by government agencies be domestically sourced. LCRs function similarly to import quotas by protecting domestic producers, but result in higher prices for consumers due to restricted foreign competition. Administrative policies are another tool governments use to control trade. These informal policies impose bureaucratic obstacles to imports. Japan, for example, has been criticized for using regulatory hurdles to limit foreign competition in its car market, where foreign car sales remain low despite Japan's relatively low formal tariffs. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, aimed to address such barriers, but the U.S. withdrew from the agreement in 2017. Both LCRs and administrative policies benefit domestic producers, but often lead to higher costs for consumers. Anti-dumping policies aim to protect domestic industries from unfair competition caused by dumping, where foreign firms sell goods at prices below their cost of production or below their fair market value. Dumping can occur when firms use profits from their home markets to subsidize lower prices abroad, sometimes as a strategy to drive out local competitors and later raise prices. Anti-dumping measures, such as those in the U.S., allow domestic producers to file complaints with government agencies like the Commerce Department and the International Trade Commission, ITC. If the complaint is valid, anti-dumping duties, special tariffs, may be imposed on the foreign imports, often lasting up to 5 years. These duties aim to counteract unfair pricing and restore a level playing field for domestic businesses. Political arguments for government intervention in trade include protecting jobs, safeguarding industries vital for national security, retaliating against unfair competition, consumer protection from harmful products, advancing foreign policy goals, and promoting human rights. The most common argument is job protection from unfair foreign competition. often when foreign producers benefit from government subsidies. For example, the U.S. has filed complaints with the WTO, such as the 2012 case against Chinese auto parts producers. However, critics argue that these claims can be politically motivated. For instance, President George W. Bush imposed steel tariffs in 2002 under the guise of unfair competition, but it was seen as a move to win votes in key states. Similarly, the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, protects European farmers but results in higher prices for consumers. National security is another argument for protectionist measures, particularly for defense-related industries like aerospace and electronics. The Trump administration used this rationale in 2018 to justify tariffs on steel and aluminium imports, although critics argued that these tariffs increased costs for U.S. defense contractors, potentially harming national security. Governments sometimes use the threat of trade intervention as a bargaining tool to open foreign markets and enforce trade rules. For instance, the U.S. pressured China in the 1990s to tighten intellectual property laws, threatening tariffs on Chinese imports. This approach was revisited during the Trump administration, which imposed tariffs on $370 billion of Chinese goods to push for stronger intellectual property laws and reduce the trade deficit. However, China retaliated by placing tariffs on U.S. farm products, severely impacting American farmers and leading to increased government subsidies for them. This strategy, while potentially effective, is risky because targeted countries may retaliate, escalating trade conflicts rather than resolving them. An example is the U.S.-China trade war, which, despite reaching a preliminary Phase I agreement in 2020, saw China falling short of its commitments to increase U.S. purchases by 40%. Another political justification for intervention is consumer protection. Governments often regulate imports to shield consumers from unsafe products. A notable case occurred in 2003 when Japan and South Korea banned U.S. beef imports after a case of mad cow disease was detected in Washington state. These bans had a significant financial impact on U.S. beef producers, but were lifted after 2 years with stricter safety requirements on imported beef. Governments often use trade policy to achieve foreign policy objectives, either by granting favorable trade terms to strengthen diplomatic ties or imposing sanctions to punish rogue states that violate international norms. For example, Iraq faced severe trade sanctions after the 1991 Gulf War, aimed at pressuring compliance with UN resolutions. Similarly, the U.S. has long maintained sanctions against Cuba to weaken its communist regime, hoping economic hardship would lead to political change. Trade sanctions have also targeted countries like Libya and Iran for supporting terrorism or pursuing nuclear weapons. These sanctions yielded some success, such as Libya abandoning its nuclear program in 2003 and Iran agreeing to curb its nuclear activities in 2015. Although the U.S. reimposed sanctions on Iran under the Trump administration. However, unilateral sanctions can be undermined when other countries continue trading with the sanctioned nation, as seen in the case of Cuba, where nations like Canada and Germany filled the void left by the U.S. In addition to political and security goals, trade policy is sometimes used to promote human rights. For example, in the 1980s and 1990s, Western nations imposed sanctions on South Africa to pressure it to end apartheid. Similarly, the U.S. placed sanctions on Myanmar for its poor human rights record, which were briefly lifted in 2012 after democratic reforms, only to be reconsidered after the 2021 military coup. The economic arguments for government intervention have seen a resurgence with the development of new trade theories and strategic trade policies. One traditional argument is the infant industry argument, dating back to Alexander Hamilton in 1792. It suggests that developing countries may have a comparative advantage in manufacturing, but need initial protection, tariffs, quotas, subsidies, to compete with established industries. However, critics argue that protection often leads to inefficient industries that struggle in the global market once protection is removed. Moreover, the assumption that firms cannot access capital markets for long-term investments has weakened with the growth of global capital markets. Countries with comparative advantages should be able to attract investments without government subsidies. Taiwanese and South Korean firms exemplify this by successfully entering industries like textiles and semiconductors without extensive protection. Efficient global capital markets suggest that industries requiring government protection may not be viable in the long term. The strategic trade policy argument suggests that government intervention can boost national income by supporting domestic firms to gain first-mover advantages in industries with substantial economies of scale. This strategy involves using subsidies to promote emerging industries and helping domestic firms overcome barriers created by foreign competitors who have already established dominance. For instance, the U.S. government's R&D grants to Boeing in the 1950s and 1960s are believed to have contributed to Boeing's success in the commercial aircraft industry. Similarly, Japan's targeted support for liquid crystal display screens led to Japanese firms outpacing U.S. competitors in that market. Governments may intervene to support key technologies, provide export subsidies, and assist domestic firms in overcoming foreign competitors' advantages. This approach, as seen in the case of Airbus, can involve a mix of home market protection and export-promoting subsidies to help domestic firms establish themselves in the global market. Strategic trade policy, which suggests government intervention to help domestic firms dominate global industries, challenges the classical free trade theories of economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. However, some economists, including Paul Krugman, who contributed to the development of new trade theory, argue that while strategic trade policy may seem promising in theory, it is problematic in practice. This critique forms part of the revised case for free trade. Krugman warns that strategic trade policies can lead to beggar-thy-neighbor situations, where one country's gain comes at the expense of others. If one country uses subsidies to support its domestic firms, it risks provoking retaliation from other nations, leading to costly trade wars. For example, if the U.S. responded to European subsidies for Airbus by increasing subsidies for Boeing, both sides might engage in a trade war that benefits neither, while burdening taxpayers. Krugman emphasizes the importance of avoiding retaliatory actions and instead advocates for establishing international rules that limit trade-distorting subsidies. The World Trade Organization, WTO, plays a key role in enforcing such rules, helping prevent trade wars and maintaining fair competition. Government interventions in the economy are often influenced by politically powerful interest groups rather than national interest. An example is the European Union's Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which benefits inefficient farmers and politicians relying on their support, but harms EU consumers by raising food prices. Paul Krugman argues that strategic trade policies are vulnerable to capture by special interest groups, which could distort the policies to serve their own interests. In the U.S., expecting agencies like the Commerce Department to ignore political pressures is unrealistic. Thus, Krugman suggests that a blanket free trade policy, with limited exceptions, might be the most practical approach, even if it's not theoretically optimal. Strong economic arguments support the benefits of unrestricted free trade, but governments are often reluctant to unilaterally lower trade barriers due to mistrust of other nations' willingness to do the same. For example, Brazil may hesitate to lower its trade barriers, fearing that Argentina will exploit Brazil's openness without reciprocating, and Argentina may have the same fear. Both nations recognize the mutual benefits of lower barriers, but are unwilling to act due to a lack of trust. This deadlock can be broken by negotiating trade rules and establishing an independent body to monitor compliance and impose sanctions on rule breakers. While this may seem like a compromise of national sovereignty, since World War II, such an international trading framework has been created. Initially known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, it evolved into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995, serving as a referee for global trade. The theoretical basis for free trade, developed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo in the late 18th century, was first adopted as official policy by Great Britain in 1846, with the repeal of the Corn Laws, which had imposed high tariffs on foreign corn imports to protect domestic producers. This change came after a long debate, intensified by a poor harvest in Britain and the looming famine in Ireland. Despite Britain's push for trade liberalization over the next 80 years, its major trading partners did not follow suit. Britain, as the world's largest exporter, maintained unilateral free trade because it had more to lose from trade wars than other nations. By the 1930s, Britain's free trade efforts were undone by the Great Depression, worsened by the 1929 U.S. stock market collapse. In 1930, the U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised tariffs to protect domestic industries. This act led to retaliatory tariff increases by other countries, a collapse in U.S. exports, and further deepened the global economic crisis. The economic repercussions of the Smoot-Hawley Act's beggar-thy-neighbor trade policies deeply impacted post-World War II economic structures and beliefs. Following World War II, the United States, having emerged victorious and economically dominant, shifted towards a pro-free trade stance after the hardships of the Great Depression. Spearheaded by the U.S., the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, was established in 1947 to promote trade liberalization by eliminating tariffs, subsidies, and import quotas among nations. Over the years, GATT's membership expanded significantly, with negotiations held in rounds to gradually reduce tariffs. The Uruguay round, concluded in 1994, marked the completion of this process. The GATT's success was evident in the significant reduction of tariffs globally, fostering economic growth as envisioned by classical economists like Ricardo. World trade and income flourished under the GATT, showcasing the benefits of a move towards free trade policies. In 1986, Amidst mounting protectionist pressures, GATT members initiated the ambitious Uruguay round of negotiations. The eighth round aimed at reducing tariffs and expanding trade regulations. This round was the most challenging yet, spanning 7 years, before culminating in an agreement on December 15, 1993, and coming into effect on July 1, 1995. The Uruguay round introduced significant provisions, including the reduction of industrial goods tariffs by over 1/3 and the elimination of tariffs on over 40% of manufactured goods. Developed nations were mandated to reduce average tariff rates on manufactured goods to less than 4%, historical lows. Agricultural subsidies were to be substantially curtailed, and rules extended to cover services and intellectual property protection. Additionally, the creation of the World Trade Organization, WTO, was outlined to oversee GATT agreements. The extension of GATT rules to services and intellectual property was deemed crucial, potentially boosting global trade in services and enhancing opportunities for high-tech companies in developing nations where intellectual property enforcement had been lacking, thus fostering greater international commerce and innovation. The clarification and strengthening of GATT rules, along with the establishment of the World Trade Organization, WTO, promise more effective enforcement of international trade agreements. The WTO serves as an overarching organization that includes GATT and 2 new agreements: the General Agreement on Trade in Services, GATS, for extending free trade to services, and the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS, to harmonize global intellectual property protections. The WTO is responsible for arbitrating trade disputes and monitoring member countries' trade policies. Unlike GATT, the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism does not allow member countries to block the adoption of arbitration reports. Such reports are automatically accepted unless there is a consensus against them. Countries found to have violated GATT rules can appeal to a permanent appellate body whose decisions are binding. If a member fails to comply with the panel's recommendations, affected trading partners can seek compensation or impose trade sanctions. The WTO's procedures are governed by strict time limits, giving it a level of enforcement power that GATT lacked. The current international trade landscape presents several pressing challenges that the World Trade Organization, WTO, is actively addressing. Key issues at the forefront include the proliferation of anti-dumping policies, high levels of protectionism in agriculture, insufficient protection for intellectual property rights, and persistent high tariff rates on non-agricultural goods and services across many nations. Anti-dumping actions, particularly prevalent in sectors like basic metals, chemicals, plastics, machinery, and electrical equipment, have raised concerns about protectionist tendencies and the exploitation of loopholes in trade regulations. In agriculture, disproportionately high tariff rates and substantial subsidies in countries like Canada, the European Union, Japan, and the United States have led to inflated prices for consumers, reduced trade volumes, and market distortions. The WTO aims to address these challenges through ongoing discussions like the Doha Round, which began in 2001, emphasizing the potential benefits of reducing trade barriers, enhancing market access, and fostering global economic growth and poverty alleviation. The World Trade Organization, WTO, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, have significantly reduced tariff rates on non-agricultural products, with most developed nations averaging around 3.8%. However, challenges persist, as exceptions like high tariff rates on specific imports into developed countries hinder market access and economic progress. For instance, Australia and South Korea maintain high bound tariff rates on transportation equipment, contrasting with lower rates in the United States, the European Union, and Japan. Service tariffs also remain elevated compared to industrial goods, with reductions expected to yield substantial benefits given the increasing value of cross-border service trade. The WTO aims to further decrease tariff rates towards zero, building on successful precedents like zero tariffs on information technology goods. Economists estimate that a comprehensive global trade agreement could boost world income annually by billions, with significant gains for poor nations. Future efforts target lowering tariffs on non-agricultural imports into developing countries, aiming to dismantle high rates that protect inefficient industries and impede economic growth, emphasizing the importance of embracing free trade for broader prosperity. In 1999, the WTO aimed to address issues such as anti-dumping actions, trade in agricultural products, intellectual property enforcement, and market access. After failed meetings in Seattle, a new round of talks began in Doha in 2001. The agenda included cutting tariffs, phasing out agricultural subsidies, easing investment barriers, and limiting anti-dumping laws. Compromises were made, with the EU and Japan conceding on subsidies and the US agreeing to revise anti-dumping rules. Environmental policies were excluded due to pressure from developing nations. An agreement allowed measures to protect public health regarding drug patents. The talks faced challenges, particularly over labor standards and subsidies. Potential winners include low-cost agricultural producers, while losers include EU and Japanese farmers, US steelmakers, and pharmaceutical firms. The talks have seen setbacks, with disagreements over reducing agricultural subsidies and tariffs causing deadlock since 2004, despite attempts to restart negotiations.
Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe to channel.